about in the book is the Fishbowl Effect, where you get a bunch of people together online, and if one says, oh, I'm an incel, that means that I'm naturally born to be on the bottom of society. You get 10 of those people, they all reinforce each other, and suddenly they can't leave. And that happens no matter whether it's like anorexia or suicidality, all sorts of mental health issues, and all sorts of they kind of convince themselves that it's very real. Because they're together online.
There was also something you referenced multiple times around, not only identifying with things like being an incel, but a sort of a general owning that it seemed like a lot of these guys had with being autistic, with saying, we are autistic, and this is where we gather, and this is what, in a way, this is kind of like our superpower, while at the same time we feel like we're at the bottom of the heap.
It's been very surprising. Sort of at first, I didn't know exactly who was on 4chan, right? I had to go and find that out. I had to guess, right? I kind of knew anecdotally, but as I've sort of now been covering it for years and years, actually a significant amount of people on there are on the spectrum somewhere, and it's not ironic. They're celebrating their autism sometimes, and a lot of the times it just happens to be that I'm not the psychiatrist, but just sort of meeting some autistic folks that are were on 4chan. What happens is, it becomes sort of an unhealthy place to retreat. That it becomes comfy, it becomes easy to do that, and that's sort of their predilection. That they sort of cultivate a little nice fantasy world that they can live in, and then it becomes more and more difficult to leave it. That ended up defining 4chan, and then sort of just defining online space, right? as these other, social networks sort of resembled 4chan, you get that sort of monetized.
The Fishbowl Effect seems to be this extremely poisoned chalice, which, as you describe, it provides community through, a sense of bonding through identity or circumstance, but the anonymity and the disembodied quality of where people are meeting means that they don't really have any real world responsibility to each other. What's really important is that the connection is maintained within the fishbowl. And that's why, the incel gets punished if they report that they actually had sex, or, the person who, we can think of a lot of examples, I suppose. But what's so strange is that the anonymity, the sharing of circumstance and identity, it serves to boost the kind of emotional crisis sense within the spaces that you describe, without there being any kind of like social buffering or comfort that can provide it or that can let it rest.
I guess the metaphor I used was a little bit like junk food, right? Where it turns out if you sell a product that is not very satisfying, but sort of gives you like a momentary relief, right? So you eat Cheetos, they're not really filling you up, but that actually makes you want to buy more, right? In the same way, you kind of sell an ersatz social network, right? You sell interaction online, and it's momentary relief because it's sort of fake social interaction. It feels good for a moment, but it never really fills you up. So you end up going back and back over and over again.
Yeah. And if the content that's being shared, or the sort of sub-themes within the discussion in that space, is already sort of hinged upon a disillusionment with the outside world or its betrayals, your coverage of the nihilism that arises in these spaces out of the fact that everybody feels cheated and let down by the promises of capitalism and consumerism. And that not only that every time there's an attempt made at countercultural thought or expression, that immediately gets snapped up into the next round of sales pitching. And so I'm wondering, how you developed your political economy analysis through all of this, because it's really kind of a through note that is so strong. You you really sink into this, Gen X sore spot of, wow, I heard Kurt Cobain sing, here we are now, entertain us. And I was driving my car and I had to pull over because I was crying. And then like 6 months later, they're selling his fucking sweater, right. At whatever Target was back then.
Right.
So yeah, how did you come to that?
I kind of started with the question I was writing the book. Well, I had to really answer for this weird culture that 4chan had grown out of when it was started in 2003, and then off another site called Something Awful, which was also very dark and cynical. So, and it reflected just the generation that was my generation and our generation, right? Where we were sort of obsessed with being nihilist or sort of having no interest in anything, right? That was sort of like the cultural malaise of the rock bands and so forth at the time too. So, and I used, there were other thinkers who wrote on this, like Barbara Ehrenreich and Zizek and so forth. Like a lot of people write on this similar idea, but I used it here to explain this idea that like what had really occurred was that, yeah, there were these countercultural movements which were about sort of like joy and breaking out of these sort of rigid societal constructs in the 60s and enjoying life and sort of like taking pleasure from life. But capitalism and marketing quickly snatched all that up and said, well, let's sell you that, right? Let's use those ideas to sell you products. And in fact, that's very limiting, right? Then you just get the little joy chopped up when you're supposed to only enjoy when you buy something. And so by the 70s and 80s, that marketing culture had just grown exponentially in this sort of post-war economy. And that by that point, by the late 90s, everyone was just sort of jaded because everything had been co-opted over and over again. And the response was, well, I'll just have nothing in my heart, so nothing can be stolen, right? Like, let's just give up. There'll be nothing to be co-opted. And that was really the environment out of which 4chan grew up. And then, obviously those dynamics are still happening where they invented memes. And then, of course, or internet memes rather. And the first thing, when internet memes blow up in 2007, the first people that cover them are the Wall Street Journal. And they ask, well, how can we monetize that?
How do we go viral?
Right. And then, later on, when the alt-right is emerging, they take Pepe the Frog on 4chan, which is a kind of a meme about being a loser in your mom's basement. And as they see it getting co-opted and sort of used in pop culture and used to sell things, then they code it in racist symbols because the idea is the old 4chan playbook, like the old punk playbook where they say, I'll just cover it in swastikas or anything that will make it poisonous, make the frog poisonous, distasteful to some corporation trying to snatch it up and use it.
Yeah. And so we have, I don't know what you would call it, like a repurposing of irony in very weird forms, which begins, as you write, as, it's another strategy to evade capture by the marketers. That irony really is a way of a generation expressing, you're not going to buy me, and you're not going to sell me back to myself. And so that twists around into, well, if I can make Pepe completely deplorable to anybody who would want to monetize him, then that actually works for me, regardless of the fact that I've just poured out hate speech onto the internet. It's such a strange and very humanizing, actually, turn of events, because I think that, on the first blush, most people will encounter Pepe with swastikas and think, the swastika Nazi skinhead has entered the room and this is what they believe. But I think the story that you tell is that no, it's very difficult to know what people actually believe beyond the fact that they are in a form of broken despair.
The irony is sort of used as a protective measure and then, as a way to sort of confuse themselves in a sense where if they kind of keep deconstructing everything and then they're left with nihilism, like you say, it just sort of like ends up reinforcing the dynamics they were trying to resist, where they're in their bedroom playing video games all day, consuming these little products that make them feel good for an instant, consuming the fantasy worlds as a way to make them feel good for an instant and then bad in the long term.